Hello and welcome everyone to the Maybe Muslim podcast. I'm Mariyam Haider, producer and host of MBM, and I'm doing a special episode for International Women's Day, a little different from the usual MBM series. In this episode, I am in conversation with two members of the LedBy Foundation, India's first leadership incubator that focuses on the professional development of Muslim women. Deepanjali Lahiri is the Chief Operating Officer, and Fatema Chiba is the Program Manager at LedBy, which has been running training plus mentoring programs and fellowships to support young Muslim women in India enter entrepreneurial and corporate workspaces. In this episode, Deepanjali and Fatima talk about their personal and professional experiences that have shaped their understanding of the challenges that Muslim women face. Fatima highlights what growing up as the only Muslim student felt like and how working with an educational nonprofit enabled a closer understanding of the way caste, gender, and class barriers impact students' aspirations and professional outlooks. Deepanjali shares how she had not hired a single Muslim woman candidate in her years of working across IT, retail, and FMCG sectors, and the differences between multinationals and Indian companies when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also discussed the current state of Muslim women participation within India's formal and informal sectors, the challenges that structural inequities impose on women, and how diverse are the career needs and visions for Muslim women in urban versus rural parts. This MBM episode also offers a glimpse of the long journey that Indian workplaces have to make towards religious diversity, inclusion, and representation across all channels of management and leadership. Finally, we talk about Seattle becoming the first American city to add caste to its anti discrimination laws and if there is hope for similar changes within India in the coming times. Hi, Deepanjali. Hi, Fatima. It's very nice to have you on the Maybe Muslim podcast. How are you both doing?
Very good. Thank you for having us, Mariyam.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm quite excited to have you both, and it's only because I have been following the work being done by LedBy for a while now, and we are celebrating International Women's Day and Women's Month, so it just makes for the perfect reason to have both of you on this conversation and really talk about the experiences and the journeys you both have made as individuals that have kind of driven you to be a part of LedBy and support its growth.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I mean, it's great that we have somebody who is an extension of the community doing this for us. So really lovely to be here.
So maybe we can start with just again talk about your personal or professional experience. And Deepanjali, we have briefly spoken about your own experience being in the industry for about 15 years, hiring people from all backgrounds. Can you maybe share a bit of that experience and then share your experience of working with LedBy?
Yeah, so I want to actually just go back to when I started off my career. So I had a really interesting career trajectory. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was just figuring my way around for I think about the first 2 or 3 years of my career. And then I settled and was really happy doing a project management role. And I grew into that role in this very large multinational organization. And I decided that this is where I want to have my career. And I worked in these really large organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees. And it was great, and I was doing really well. But I remember every single day I used to come back and I used to either tell my family or my friends that, I'm not happy. I don't know why, but like something is missing and I don't know what it is. And anyway, that happened for about like 13 years. And then COVID hit. And I said that the world is in turmoil. And if everything is changing, then I should change as well. And it was the worst time to actually leave my job, I remember, and everybody was against it. But I said that let me just drop and see what happens. What is the worst that is going to happen? And I said that let me move to social development because that seems to give people a lot of joy. And I'm sure that it would be a great opportunity for me, because now I've learned everything, and I want to see if I can contribute to another industry, because by then I had switched about three industries by then, 3 or 4 industries. And I said social development, I'm sure, is a place that I would be able to figure this out as well. So I took the plunge and I started developing networks. I didn't have anybody, I didn't know anyone, I didn't, I had no connections, no networks. And I started meeting people, and I was speaking with multiple people. And then through all of that, I met Ruha, and I remember she was my 51st founder or organization that I had spoken to. And it really clicked, and I don't know what it was, but I remember through that conversation we began talking. And she said, why are you interested in this organization, and we work with Muslim women and all of that. And I said, why are you interested in speaking with me? I'm not a Muslim woman. um, but through that conversation, I remember chatting with her, and I told her, I said, hey, you know what? I said, I think, like, unconsciously, I'm really intrigued with what you do, because I don't have a Muslim friend at that point, 13 years into my career, and all of that. I didn't have a Muslim friend. I had worked with one Muslim colleague, and worst of all, I had hired no Muslim women, no Muslims. And for me, when I was chatting with Ruha, I remember, like, feeling really weird about it, and feeling this, I was embarrassed and also really surprised at myself. And I said, what's going on? I consider myself a really liberal person, and I come from a liberal background in education and family and everything. I said, what's going on? There must be something wrong. So anyway, through that, I got the role, and I started working with Ruha. But I understand now why this role is additionally special for me, because I think it also represents a lot of what today's workforce industry is like. There are more people like me than there are, like, anybody from our community, from the LedBy community. And what does tend to happen is that we eventually hire people like us, which is why we see more women. Or firstly, we don't see more women, but if we do see more women, they're mostly from backgrounds like mine, pedigree like mine. Which is, I think, a problem, because then you're not truly being diverse, and diversity is a question that everybody is raising right now, and you're not being true to yourself. So I think that was what led me to LedBy, and that's why I'm still here. So it's a much larger problem that I'm trying to also work towards along with LedBy, and it also does give me a lot of personal joy as well.
Dipanjali, before I move Fatima to you, Dipanjali, I have a follow-up question, which is, can you define the pedigree that you come from?
Yeah. So I'm from a convent educated school. It was the best school in the city that I lived in. I studied a specialized college. I had a specialized college education, and it was from the best college for that particular course. And of course, that course had nothing to do with my career. So I studied hotel management. And it has nothing to do with business strategy or project management, but it still was a really good college. So that's the pedigree I mean. So I also do know what others look for in terms of pedigree. So when you look for somebody, when you're hiring somebody, and you look for, you can eliminate people's names and the cities that they're from, but when you look at that college, or when you look at companies that they work for, I mean, that's the pedigree that we're talking about. So if you look at somebody who's from a tier 1 college, or who's worked in a name brand multinational organization, you automatically switch and say, hey, this person must be ready to go and must be really good. But that is a problem today, and that's what we're also trying to eliminate.
That takes me, Fatima, to you now, because as Dipanjali was saying, she has a background which will be considered sort of a pedigree, one of the best institutions to work from, work with, have highly educated background. Fatima, you have, I'm sure, have that as well, along with the fact that you represent a minority community. And in your
Yes,
experience, how has that modulated your understanding of the workforce industry in India today?
right. I think, yeah, I completely echo what you're saying in terms of me having had some of these opportunities while also being a minority in this country, right? And I think it goes to say the difference in experiences are not that much for me. And what I would go on to say is that I did a fellowship where I taught students, and that's where my understanding of inequity even began. Before that, I had no concept of what that word meant, or what diversity meant, what inclusion meant. It was just not a part of my world. Because I was just, yeah, like, a privileged kid living in Mumbai, going to the best schools, going to the best college. And in those spaces, even if there was some sort of discrimination, I wasn't at a place to recognize it. That's how school and college was for me. And as I moved into working with communities in Mumbai and students in Mumbai who came from backgrounds that weren't privileged, and work and like really working in a government school of Mumbai, I realized that the inequities that existed are large, just in terms of the opportunities I received and the opportunities the students that I worked with received. Um, and within that group of students as well, inequities existed, right? So it started with gender. I saw how the parents of the male students would react when something went wrong with, let's say, behavior or marks or whatever. And it was more about, oh, how do we get this person back on track? Whereas with my girl students, it would often be like, if she's not studying, then let's just let's just pull her out, because I don't want this extra tension, you know
Mm.
and it literally just started for me from there, and from a point of saying that, oh, like, even within this there is so much inequity, and therefore everyone's experience of these things can be so different. um, and then I delved one level deeper within the gender itself of my students, and within my girl students, I started also experiencing more inequities when it came to students from other backgrounds versus from minority backgrounds. And by minority, I mean Muslims, Dalits, those groups as well, right? Who've migrated from like very very poor parts of the country versus people who've like been in Mumbai and have had some sort of background in Mumbai. So those were the kinds of backgrounds I started noticing, which really affected from the get go how these students were even performing in class, because there's so much more to a person being able to do well. Like the environment needs to sort of facilitate that, and that itself isn't there, right? So the inequity and the gap starts so much earlier than we even talking about, where we're talking about like workforce and opportunities in the workplace. I go back right up to that, like up to schooling and maybe even like early childhood care, where these girls are already on a disadvantage, and that's where they sort of start, right? So it's really important to even go back and look at it from a lens of saying that it's not only about saying equal opportunities, but it's also about bridging this gap that starts so many years before we even get to a place of um, hiring these women in the workforce. And so that brought me to like, so I worked at this organization for up to 6 years in different capacities, really looked at the problem from different angles. Then went on to do a master's in social entrepreneurship, where I also like really learned about other facets of what it means to work in a system to make it more equitable. And at that point I was looking for something, yeah, something where I could like, where I felt excited, where I felt like, okay, this is what I want to do. And I thankfully found LedBy. And so therefore the three reasons that really brought me here, one is just everything that I explained about how I have come to understand inequity, and therefore the resources we need to put into a certain group to not only bring them up to speed, but also to facilitate that space for them in terms of learning, in terms of a safe space. They don't have that, right? So that needs to be given. And I see LedBy doing that for this group of people. So that's my first reason. My second is basically the fact that this group of people are people that I identified with. I didn't have this group of women. Maybe I had other spaces that facilitated learning and were safe spaces for me, but not a group of people that I immediately identify with based on this particular aspect, right? So that was the second piece that really got me here. And the third is that the team is lovely. So I actually spoke to different people in the team, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be a really fun team to work with. And I think that's also like 8 hours. I'm spending 8 hours of my day with these people. It has to be fun, and it has been really, really fun.
Thank you, Fatima. I think a very important and strong note that you make while explaining your experience is the large gap of opportunity and effectively inequity that kind of tantamounts up until the point someone even reaches the point of applying for jobs. We are not just looking at someone's educational background, we're looking at their social settings, we're looking at the economic settings as well, and the interlacing of all of them together. My question to both of you, and you both can decide who wants to go first for this, is through your fellowships and the accelerator program, how have you identified these gaps at different magnitudes as you receive applications from all over India? And what have been your experiences and observations in mitigating those gaps, in closing those gaps? Deepanjali?
Yeah, so we've been very intentional about who we bring on to our programs. So, our programs, we have two programs. We have a leadership development program, which is for early stage working professionals, and we have an accelerator program, which is a professional development program, which is for any Muslim woman who is, any Indian Muslim woman who is 18 to 30 years old. So you could be at any career stage, so you could be a fresher, or you could have about 3 or 4 years of work experience. You could be somebody who is returning, or you're making a career comeback. You could be somebody who has a current gap in her career. So what we really do is, our programs are not meant for, or we don't actually intake people who are the best. We don't intake people who are from the best pedigreed college, or if you are a topper in your class, because what we do then believe is that you have the access and you most likely have the agency. It would be great branding for LedBy if we did bring on such people, because of course you'd be a flag bearer. But what we're really trying to do is, we're trying to penetrate the length and the breadth of the country, identifying women who don't have that access and who don't have that agency. So we are looking for people from tier 2 cities, and most likely tier 3 as well. We are looking for people from who are first generation learners. We are looking for people who are from low income households as well. And for us, low income means somebody who's got less than 5 lakhs per annum annual income. So we are looking for people like that, and that's what we do as part of our application process. So one would imagine that if we do intake, like, let's say 30 people into a program, why do we spend 3 months in the application process? This is why, because we are looking for people who don't have that agency, who don't have that access, but who have the aspiration, who really wants to strive very hard to get ahead in her career. So we look for those traits through multiple rounds, and identify the candidates who deserve our program the most. So that's what we try to do, and that's why we spend so much time on our entire application.
And would you have a sort of ratio of how successful this kind of efforts, how successful these kinds of efforts are for every program?
Yeah, so for both programs collectively, that's how we do our analysis. So we do have 60% of our current participants who are from low income households. But what we don't have is, we don't have as many from tier 2 and tier 3 cities. I think our tier 1 ratio is about 40%, and tier 2 and tier 3 is about 60%. We still want to be able to penetrate into the smaller cities as well. But I think the reason why that is because, and it's not an excuse, but I think the reason why we still get a lot more applications from tier one cities is because our programs are virtual, and
Hmm.
there you have to have a device, you have to have stable internet. So it's most likely that's why. But we are working towards making sure that we do reach colleges, students, working communities from the tier two cities as well. But we definitely do have that 60% low income household group.
And I think also it's because, I mean, you're still a relatively new foundation and you've just started. And I was particularly interested when I was going through how you must have managed the COVID impact as well. I mean, you kind of started much at the cusp of the pandemic, to
Yeah.
speak. And you took it from there, you onboarded people, you created teams. And I think that's a fantastic effort that must be lauded for everything that you both and the team collectively has been doing. In terms of going the way of fellowships versus accelerators, in a way that you want to showcase women that these are some of the pain points that you might have. For example, resume development, for example, preparing for an interview, writing cover letters. How much of it is mostly a challenge for women who are in there, so undergraduate, just finishing college level, to women who have, like you said, taken a break from work for different responsibilities, and then they are trying to return. So the way that you look at this accelerator program, how do you manage the efforts when you have this very diverse cohort? Fatima?
So I think when it comes to skill, right? Like we're talking about skills here, like resume building, like how do you create your LinkedIn profile? These are skills. And so through our workshops, what we do is we sort of build on the skills of these particular topics. And what we've often realized is that here the needs are pretty homogeneous in terms of saying that, hey, this is how you do it. Now when you're talking about the differences, right, like in terms of the nuance of saying that, hey, like my resume needs to be slightly different because of this like 5-year gap that I've had for xyz reason. For that, what we do is we have a bunch of advisors. We have about 100 advisors onboarded with us who sort of offer one-on-one office hours to our all our participants. And in that space, our participants really get into the nuance of what they're seeking, right? It could be that they really just want to chat about the field that they want to go into, or they might actually bring their resume to that one-on-one and say that, hey, can you look at it and can you help me like tweak it? So our one-on-ones open up that space to really go into the nuance and cater to our participants one-on-one and their needs one-on-one.
Hmm.
So that's how we like do it at LedBy.
And in the experience of running these programs, are there any particular sectors that you see your participants really keen on entering? Because by the way I have seen all of your alumni and also some of the fellows, they come from very different colleges, universities, doing some very interesting, very different things. But I'm curious to know if that's another lens that you are working with.
Honestly, we're completely like industry agnostic.
Hmm.
And this is the reason, right? Because like we have like over the past 4 years, we've just seen such a large diverse group needing similar support. So we're like, hey, like actually it doesn't matter which field you come from. These are some basic skills that are going to help you in any field, help you get ahead in any field, right?
Hmm.
And therefore our mix is pretty large. So we have like, we have a 30% from the STEM backgrounds. We have like another like 20 to 30% from development and like journalism, creative arts, that background. And then we also have people from like in the public sector, so like people who are aspiring to move into like IAS positions, things like that. So we really like have that entire range. And what we've realized is that, and there are two kinds of challenges in the larger, like larger scheme of things. One is a entry challenge, like an entry barrier challenge. So it could be an entry to a college, it could be entry to a job, and so we're really looking and like trying to solve that. And the second challenge, again in the larger scheme of things, is once you've entered a particular job or a college, how do you take that next step? Like how do you take a step into the into a leadership position, or into like into a job that's like worthy of the education that you've had, things like that. So that's a second kind of challenge that we're trying to solve. Now where you want to go is totally okay. Like you want to be in STEM, you want to be in, like, we'll figure it out for you, because we have that range of advisors to really, that we also rely on to, you know, get feedback, to get advice, so that we can then support our participants.
I am actually, you've kind of ended this on a very important note and very interesting note to move towards the DEI aspect of the Indian workforce, the workplaces that we all have participated in. Maybe Deepanjali, you can start with this because earlier in the interview you mentioned that for 15 years you did not hire a single Muslim woman. You have interviewed them, you had interacted with them, but there was no, it just was something that now that you think back had never happened. Can you maybe shed more light on that? Talk about like the DEI principles that most of the bigger corporate workplaces today want to embody and envision, and maybe start with what has changed, how successful they have been, and then what are the challenges that they're still struggling to overcome.
Yeah. So one of the things, so you're absolutely right. I had interviewed multiple women from various backgrounds, but I hadn't eventually hired them because I remember the organizations that I had worked in, we had very specific requirements, both hard skills, soft skills, competencies, all of that. And for whatever reason, I didn't hire them. But when I was starting off my career, diversity and equity and inclusion were words that we were just not familiar with. We didn't have a diversity leader and we didn't have DEI and all of that. We just didn't, But I remember about 3 or 4 years into my career, and I was working for a large American multinational at that point. We started talking and we started, joining trainings for inclusion of LGBTQI plus. And for me, that was fantastic because I was young and I said, wow, that it's a really cool opportunity. And, why haven't we thought of this before? And why does this mandate have to come from our corporate headquarters? So I was part of that. And then I slowly started seeing, how that organization that I had worked in really imbibed those strategies. And the way they used to do it was to have very specific mandates saying that, hey, for every single department, we're going to have these agendas as part of our diversity and inclusion. And this is way into I was already about 4 or 5 years into that organization. But they had specific agendas that we had to meet. And these agendas came from our leadership in the organization. The other thing that they used to do is that on a quarterly basis, we used to go back to those agendas and say, hey, we used to use data and we used to say, hey, are we meeting those or not? And if we are, then great, celebrate. But if we're not, then, why are we not meeting those? And then after that, we used to also be very particular about where we were tapping into our hiring pools. So our sourcing pools at that, previously was limited. We used to go to campuses. We used to have very few lateral hiring. But then we expanded and we said, let's diversify our pool and let's bring in and let's partner with organizations that support the LGBTQI community. And that was great in that organization. And then cut to 12 years or 13 years into my career, I realized that diversity and inclusion in India continues to remain in this very narrow spectrum. And when you talk about diversity in India really means two. It means gender and it means sexual preference. And for me, it blows my mind that I've spent over a decade and the conversation is exactly the same, you know. And there are very few organizations, and I have to say that there are very few American organizations that I have worked in where the diversity spectrum has slightly broadened, and they do talk about caste, they do talk about religion, they have specific religious groups or affinity groups within their organizations. But that's in America, you know, and maybe parts of Europe. We just do not have that in India. In India, the diversity spectrum has remained as is, and you can call yourselves, you know, equal opportunity, but our diversity agenda remains very, very limited. And you know, and this is something that I bring up in conversations with my colleagues and now friends who continue to stay in recruitment. And when I talk about diversity, immediately the conversation is around gender, but I'm like, no, but that's not what I mean. Even within gender, even within women, there are multiple intersectionalities, and are you even looking at it? You know, and if you are looking at it, what areas are you looking at? And I can tell you very clearly that religion is definitely not one of them. And that's a huge problem. And the sad part is that there are also very few organizations that are talking about religious diversity, you know, and which is why the work that we do at LedBy is so very important. And we need to speak more loudly and, you know, much more about this problem that continues to exist in India.
Religious diversity is also something which I have seen is not just something you are silent about, it's something that we often miss out on educating or informing ourselves about as well. I particularly can share from my own experience that by virtue of having a Muslim name, for the colleagues that I used to have when I was working in India, there were some very obvious questions or remarks about if Ramzan was going on, then there would be around the concept of fasting. You know, if Eid was around, it would be around food, which I think is a very minimalist or a very small aspect of bringing your religious identity or having a religious identity. It is an important part, but it can be much more than that. Um, and at that point again, I think Fatima will associate with me on this, is that when you grow in a place, or if you've always been sort of like the only Muslim student in the class or the only Muslim colleague for to someone in a department, you don't see them as clearly, or you don't pay that much attention until you come out of that space and you actually spend time and wonder what more could have been done to really have conversations where I can assess and understand that diversity of religion, and within that religion, the diversity of life choices and lifestyles can be talked about, can be known, because then the binaries start breaking away very easily, right? And I feel with led by also, this is a question I was thinking over, that while you have Indian Muslim women as an umbrella, that under which you are getting more women to join, learn, educate themselves, you know, expand their horizons, there must be so much diversity that you see and you learn from. And maybe you can share a few examples of your experiences there, and that would be great to really continue the conversation.
So I think firstly, I identified with everything that you said. You're so right that I felt it too, right? I've always felt a pressure to fit a mold in every space, like in a school space, in a college space, saying that, oh, because I'm Muslim, like it gets reduced to these one or two practices, or maybe five practices that
Right.
they believe they know about Muslims, and therefore you can't be anything else but that. And if you have to, then you have to really break out of that mold, which is unfair for us, like to expect from a student, or from someone who's really trying to figure out who they are at that point, right? So how do you do that while also fighting something? Like it's like a really huge problem. And I think what LedBy did, it was my first month, I think, at LedBy. And we had this identity panel with our fellows. And so we had three women who are older Muslim women, One came from journalism, one came from a communications background, and one came from like she works at a multinational tech company, right? And it was so interesting to hear what these three women had to say, and also again very differently brought up, very different identities. One chose to wear a hijab, the other two weren't in hijabs, and they were talking to our fellows, and our fellows had such similar problems. They were just like, oh, like I work somewhere and I walk into this room which is like a room full of men, and the only way I see I can connect is by like picking up a glass of like wine or alcohol, because that's the only place they connect out of work, and a lot of opportunities get like distributed around that time. But I am not allowed, I mean, I'm not part of that group because of my identity, and it's so unfair. And it was so relatable to the rest of the group, and we're like, oh yeah, like these are instances that we've all faced in our lives, and there is a certain exclusion there as well, right? And then all of these women also spoke of different parts of their life where they faced exclusion, based on the clothes that they're wearing, the religion that they follow, or don't follow, or like or like questions
Right.
around that and things like that. And one thing, one common thread that came from all three of their conversations was that if you're in a space where you're feeling this exclusion all the time, then that place is not for you. You rather move out and use your talent and use your energies in a place where that's going to be better accepted than continue being in a toxic environment. um, and I think that was, of course, I mean, one could argue that would also be a privileged way of looking at things. I mean, every person does not have the liberty to say that, oh, I'm going to quit because I'm feeling discriminated against and just move on. But it's also a way of standing up, right? Saying that, hey, like this is where, like this is my line, and I'm not going to cross this beyond this point. The other thing that came out in terms of stories around that same point was, in that group, like I said, there was this woman who was in a hijab, and this other person who was our fellow said that, hey, like I identify as a Muslim, but like I drink, I smoke, and like I don't like do any of these other uh like typically Muslim things, like in their most yeah, typical sense. And it was so interesting to see that conversation happen, because this lady is like, oh, that's really cool, like I mean, I respect you for who you are, I see you, and you're still part of my sisterhood. And also getting that sort of support, yeah, from a group of women, it was so empowering to see. You go like, oh, like this is finally a space where all aspects of my identity are accepted. I don't have to hide away any parts of me to be able to be accepted in this space, and that's so powerful, right? To have that. So yeah, that was something I wanted to share.
It is absolutely thrilling to hear you say all of that, Fatima. And as you saw, I was sharing small hearts while you were saying that. Deepanjali, please go ahead.
Yeah, for me, it's more academic, because I remember when we had completed our hiring bias study, and we were traveling across India. Ruha and myself, we were traveling across India, and we were sharing parts of our study with academic groups and student groups, and just a wide range of people. And we had traveled across the north and very deeply across the south. And one of the biggest differences I saw, and I know that Muslim women are not a homogeneous group, I know that now. And I learned that very quickly in my first couple of months in LedBy, just like Fatima. I had also learned that really quickly. But from a very academic sense, I remember when I was traveling to the south, and we were sharing about our research, and our research study claimed that if you have these two profiles in front of you, one with a Hindu sounding name and one with a Muslim sounding name, organizations or recruiters would prefer to hire um, the Hindu sounding person 47%, or yeah, almost 50% more times than the Muslim sounding woman. And we had, when people were traveling to the north, everybody was like, yes, this has happened, and we're, it's not surprising, it's terrible, what can we do to change it? But in the south, the conversation was completely different. And they turned around and said, no, that's not true. I want to look at your data, and I want to see which industries you're looking at, because I can see it in my own community. Muslim women are being hired much more. And we saw it amongst students, we saw it amongst academics, and we saw it amongst professionals. And that difference between the north and the south itself was so startling, and I loved it, because our entire strategy in the south completely changed. And we said, great, tell us what you are doing differently, so that we can take all of those learnings and then utilize it and then share it amongst our friends, across the rest of the country, because you're obviously doing something which is different. And they didn't say that it's equally represented, but they're saying that, like, we're pretty much the same here, there is no discrimination. And that for me was really, really startling. And that was one experience that I know that I'm going to carry for the rest of my life, because your data can say one thing, but there are lived experiences of women, in different Muslim women in different parts of the country, who don't agree with that. And I loved it. I loved that experience that we had with our hiring bias research in the south.
You're right. I'm equally thankful to you that you're sharing this on the podcast as well, because one of the key ways that I've constantly tried to grow this space of MBM is to constantly go back and question, what do I perceive as Indian Muslimness? I might have some experiences, and I have lived with a certain, I am born with that identity. That cannot be the full identity of the spectrum of what constitutes India. And what you're sharing with me is actually kind of reaffirming that in South the picture can be very different. When Fatima, when you shared about being in a place where there was one woman who was wearing a hijab and two others who were not, it also constantly underlines that homogeneity is such a poor indicator of having of understanding a community. you know it's good to have an understanding of what largely the community represents, but it is very poor to understand just the scope of diversity. And I'm using the word diversity because that's the aim of this conversation as well. That while you are exclusively working to enhance the opportunities for Indian Muslim women, that is not homogenous group. That is not something that has a monolithic understanding or expectation as well. In fact, I was going through some of your in your blogs on your website. There are so many students and former fellows who have talked about just that the fact that they could not associate with certain aspects of Muslim identity or the behavior of the community as well. I think there was one alumni who has written that she looks at the responsibility of what privileged Muslims carry in the country as well. you know we can understand that there is lack of opportunity, and there are difficulties and challenges for Indian Muslims to access certain opportunities. But having said that, what is the responsibility with the privilege that you carry? And I think it's a fantastic way to constantly reassess the positions we are in terms of what has changed. And Deepanjali, this question kind of is for you, because you have explained through the conversation the DEI and the sort of like the token with which it is carried in the Indian organizations. What do you think with the also, I would say, the impact of how the American and the larger European workplaces have also been constantly shifting? We have the, I know, anti-caste discrimination law in Seattle now. What do you think can be the impact of those kinds of massive efforts on Indian workplaces today? And do you see a domino effect at some point emerging?
Do I see a domino effect emerging now? No. But my hope is that it does, because just like, you know, hiring for diversity when it came to gender, hiring for diversity when it came to sexual orientation, that came from the West, to be honest. It didn't emerge from here. I'm hoping that it does happen, whether it takes, I hope it happens quickly. I hope it happens sooner rather than later. But what we should do, and which is why I say that the work that we do at LedBy is so very important, is a lot of what we're doing is we're actually trying to change system. We're trying to make systemic changes, by eventually making policy level changes. But I hope that when we do work with organizations, and I will say that while there are larger organizations that have specific diversity agendas for religions, I will say that there have been a lot of Indian organizations that partner with us very specifically because they say that they do want to hire religious minorities as well, which is great. But is that happening um, on a large scale? It's not, which is why we carry the burden of making sure that we are speaking loudly about the work that we're doing. We're showcasing the talent that we have in our hiring pools, and we're making sure that organizations hire this talent and then say, what more they can do, and then eventually expand their diversity scope as well. So that's really what I hope to see Indian organizations do. It is slow, but I'm hoping that that changes.
I have a final question for either of you. And I do think it's something that, again, is very fundamental to understanding women's participation, women's labor participation in India. When we look at the actual numbers, and I'm talking about for all women, it's still 30% of the women in the formal sector. Remaining percentage is still in the informal space. And I think all of us interact with the informal sector almost on a daily basis. It's particularly not a question for you both for as representatives of LedBy, but as women who have been in the Indian workforce for a long period of time. What changes at the policy level, at the institutional levels, do you see can really change that percentage? And when we look at the marginalized or the minority status within the informal sector, then again the challenges just add up.
I'm happy to start, and then Fatima, you can jump in. So you're absolutely right. We, as women, we do interact with other women who are in the informal workspace. I think at the policy level, what really needs to change is that we need to pay attention to the fact that women are not getting paid for are getting yeah not getting paid for a lot of the labor and the household work that is uh, is being showcased, um, and that is a large part of their day, right? So that's one. The second is the informal workspace needs to be more organized. Like there aren't enough organizations that are doing things to support domestic workers or laborers. There just isn't. And I think, again, like the West, there are very slow changes that are being made over there, and those can be adopted over here. So that's, I think, something that needs to be done, and again needs to be done very very quickly. Because if you look at certain, so while we do have statistics, right, that there the informal workspace is poor, and there's just poor representation of women in the overall workforce. Look at certain states. So look at Tamil Nadu, a state which is very very high on labor when it comes to manufacturing, like textile manufacturing, very very high there. So what are they doing differently? So what are the changes that they've implemented, learning from there? There are states like, I think, Arunachal Pradesh is the other one, which is, no, maybe not Arunachal Pradesh, but Tamil Nadu for sure is a state that we can learn so much from. So I'd love to see what policy level changes they've made, so that we can imbibe those for the rest of the states. So that's just something that I wanted to share. Fatima?
I think the first thing that I want to say off the bat is that, like, I wouldn't pretend to know how to answer that question, even because what I understand of this problem is that it's a wicked problem, right? There are so many indicators that really sort of um, that uh, bleed into the fact that this person has the agency, the right, the skills, and the right mindsets to go out there and work, be it formal, informal, whatever that is. And therefore, what I would say is that from my limited lens in the work that I've done, right, I would say that it's, in terms of policy level work, it really needs to be, the key is the implementation. So if you go back and look at policies since independence, things have been systematically been put into place for many, many years. And with each time, they are getting more progressive as well. If you go back and look at policies from 1947, we are one of those countries that actually is more equal when it comes to gender rights than many, many countries out there in the world, including the West, right? So to begin with, we were more equal in that sense. The problem lies in the implementation and the socialization of people. Like, how are we really building it into our social fabric? Because policy is there, and we can keep working on it at that level. But how is it really trickling down to the nth user? And I think that's the work that needs to be done. And I'm so glad that now in India we do have these social consultancies, things like that, who are actually just purely working on these pieces. But is there a place where we can do like more work there from the government? Because that's where large scale change can take place and policy level work can be done. So I think, yeah, that's my take on this piece.
Deepanjali?
And just a last thought, we also have to go back and see who is really making these policy level changes. Who is in that cabinet? Who is making these changes? Today, a lot of the changes that are being made for women and for diversity, equity, all of that, maybe not from the representatives of the community. So, if you are changing policies or if you are implementing policies for women, then you know, have a board or have a cabinet that contains the representation that you truly need. So that's what we really also need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think representation, and representation that is driven by commitment to change, is kind of like the foundation of any policy level change that can happen. I believe in a lot of cases we have seen where representation is tokenism. You will have women cabinet ministers, you will have just MLAs and MPs. They are given seats. It happens at the lowest of rungs as well. It happens at the panchayat level where the sarpanch is a woman, but she will be the one making 25 rotis per meal for the family. So the distribution of labor, the understanding, and again, Fatima, just going back to what you were saying, the social fabric, I think conversations that are happening within homes, within workplaces, within larger communities need to challenge the biases, need to challenge the unconscious biases, the conscious biases, the stereotypes. And I really think that today's conversation has, in its limited manner, covered all those aspects. And I'm truly, truly grateful to both of you for making the time for this. Thank you so much for joining Maybe Muslim. And again, I deeply appreciate the work being done by your team and the LedBy Foundation.
Thank you so much, Mariam. This was great. Thank you for giving us this platform, and I hope to everybody who is listening, that you do your little part to make sure that you also are part of a more diverse community.
Thank you, Mariam. It was a lovely conversation. I feel like I've had so many sparks just within this conversation, which I'm going to take back into my
Thank
work.
you.